A submarine that doesn't even have a design yet is already changing how the Navy thinks about its most lethal weapon system. According to recent reporting, the Navy is evaluating an advanced payload launcher for its future attack submarine, the eventual successor to the Virginia-class boats that have anchored the undersea fleet for more than 2 decades. The idea builds on something the Navy already proved works: cram more missile capacity into a single hull. But this time, it's not a retrofit. It's a blank sheet of paper. Here's the real question, and it's not how many missiles. It's why the Navy needs to reopen that question at all, years before the ship it's meant for has even been formally designed. To get there, you need to know what a payload launcher actually does inside a submarine hull, how it differs from the vertical launch systems already in service, and what's pushing the Navy to think this far ahead. So start with the basics. A submarine's weapons don't sit in a magazine the way a surface ships do. They live in vertical tubes built into the pressure hull, sealed against the ocean outside, fired either straight up through the water or, for torpedoes, out through angled tubes near the bow. Virginia-class submarines currently in service use 2 main weapon paths. Up front, there are torpedo tubes, and on early hulls, 12 individual missile tubes angled around the bow, each holding a single Tomahawk cruise missile. That gave the earliest Virginia-class boats a respectable but limited strike capacity compared to the 4 converted Ohio-class submarines they eventually replaced in that role. Boats that, according to public Navy data, could each carry up to 154 Tomahawks. That gap is what the Virginia payload module was built to close. Starting with the Block V boats, the Navy inserted an extra 84-foot section into the middle of the hull, adding 4 large-diameter tubes, each able to hold 7 Tomahawks. That's 28 additional missiles on top of the 12 already in the bow, bringing total capacity to around 40. Structurally, it's the same submarine, just stretched and reinforced to carry more. Stretching a hull isn't a small engineering decision, though. Submarine pressure hulls are built to a design tolerance where every added foot changes the flex, the noise signature, and the stress load the boat has to survive at depth. Naval engineers spent years validating that the Virginia payload module wouldn't wreck the quietness that makes an attack submarine useful in the first place. It worked. But it also told the Navy there's a ceiling on how much more it can bolt onto an existing design before it has to start over. That's the part that matters for what comes next. A next-generation payload launcher isn't described, in the reporting, as another module to insert into an existing hull. It's described as a system being evaluated for a ship that doesn't exist yet. The program the Navy calls SSN-X, the planned eventual successor to the Virginia-class. That distinction is bigger than it sounds. Designing a launcher for a submarine that's still just a set of requirements on paper means the Navy isn't only asking how to fit more missiles. It's asking a harder question. What does an attack submarine even need to do in the 2040s and beyond? And that answer is being shaped right now by a fleet the Navy didn't design at all, one being built 4,000 miles away. China's submarine force has grown substantially over the past 2 decades, in hull count and in the sophistication of individual boats, according to U.S. Department of Defense assessments delivered to Congress in recent years. Those assessments have flagged undersea capability as an area where the gap the Navy has traditionally relied on is narrowing. That's context, not alarm. Submarine forces are notoriously hard to count and compare precisely because so much of their value lies in what can't be observed. Still, it's the backdrop behind almost every Navy statement about why SSN-X needs to be more capable than what it replaces, not just equally capable. Here's where it gets complicated. SSN-X isn't the only expensive submarine program competing for the same shipyards, the same trained workforce, and the same dollars. The Columbia-class ballistic missile submarine, the boat carrying the sea-based leg of the U.S. nuclear deterrent, has top priority at the same 2 shipyards that would build SSN-X. Government Accountability Office reports over the past several years have repeatedly flagged submarine construction as behind schedule, constrained by workforce shortages more than funding alone. You can approve a next-generation payload launcher on paper. Building the submarine around it, on time, is a separate fight entirely. That's not speculation about SSN-X's fate. It's the well-documented industrial reality the program has to survive no matter what the payload launcher ends up looking like. So the Navy is threading a needle. Design a launcher ambitious enough to matter against a growing undersea threat, without designing a submarine so complex it becomes the next program that slips a decade behind schedule. That tension is exactly why this is still, right now, a program under study. Not a contract, not a keel laying, not even a locked set of requirements. I went through several years of Navy budget justification documents and unclassified statements to the House and Senate Armed Services Committees while putting this together, and one thing stood out. SSNX shows up year after year, mostly in the research and development lines. Money for studies, trade space analysis, early design work. It's not yet a program of record with a construction contract attached. That matters, because anything reported about a payload launcher for this submarine describes something still being weighed among competing concepts, not a finalized design. What surprised me most, digging through that, wasn't that the Navy is thinking about a bigger launcher. It's how conservative the public documentation is about committing to specifics. Hull size, tube count, missile mix. This early. That restraint looks deliberate. Locking in a launcher design before locking in the ship's overall requirements is exactly the kind of sequencing mistake that has cost other Navy shipbuilding programs years of rework. Here's what this says about where naval shipbuilding actually stands. The era of simply stretching a proven hull to add capability, the way the Virginia payload module did, may be running out of room. A next-generation launcher suggests the Navy thinks the next submarine needs to be engineered differently from the ground up, not just lengthened. Whether that turns out to be true, or whether SSNX ends up looking more evolutionary than revolutionary once the trade studies wrap, is genuinely still open. So here's the layer underneath the headline. This isn't really a story about missile tubes. It's a story about whether the Navy can afford, in workforce and shipyard capacity, to build whatever it eventually designs. A launcher is only as real as the submarine built around it, and right now the submarine itself is still a set of trade-offs on a whiteboard. Here's the part that'll probably draw some disagreement. Pouring more design money into a next-generation launcher for a submarine that's still a decade or more from construction, while the current submarine building pipeline is already backlogged, risks becoming a paper capability. Impressive on a briefing slide, irrelevant if the shipyards can't turn it into steel on the timeline that matters. That's not a knock on the engineers doing the trade studies. It's a question about sequencing. One congressional oversight bodies have raised about this exact program before. What do you think? Is it smarter for the Navy to lock in an ambitious next-generation design now, even if it takes longer to build, or would an incremental upgrade to the existing Virginia-class formula get real capability into the water faster? There's no obviously correct answer, and it's worth arguing about in the comments. There's a technical wrinkle worth naming, too, because it explains why just make the tubes bigger isn't a simple fix. Payload tube diameter is tied directly to what a submarine can launch. Today's large diameter tubes were sized around the Tomahawk cruise missile and, on the Ohio-class SSGNs, larger payloads like reconnaissance and special operations gear. If a next-generation launcher is meant to fit weapons or unmanned systems that don't exist yet, engineers have to guess at dimensions for hardware still in development elsewhere in the Pentagon. Guess too small, and the submarine can't carry the next generation of weapons it's supposed to fight with. Guess too large, and you've added hull volume, weight, and cost for capability you may never use. The Navy hasn't resolved that publicly, and it's one of the genuinely open engineering questions behind this evaluation. Put yourself in the seat of a Navy requirements officer for a second. You're being asked to lock in a launcher's physical dimensions for a submarine that won't be in the water until sometime in the 2040s, against weapons that are still concepts in other labs, against a Chinese submarine fleet whose trajectory a decade out can only be estimated. Every dimension you pick is a bet. That's the job SSNX's payload launcher study actually is. So where does that leave things, as of this reporting? Confirmed, the Navy is doing early trade space work exploring payload options for its next-generation attack submarine, building conceptually on the added capacity logic proven by the Virginia payload module. Confirmed, SSNX remains in the research and pre-design phase, not under construction contract. Unconfirmed, and worth treating as such, any specific tube count, missile capacity figure, hull dimension, or delivery date attached to a next-generation launcher. Reporting at this stage reflects a program under study, and study phase concepts change, sometimes a lot, before a submarine design is finalized. One detail that stuck with me going through the budget language: the Navy consistently frames this work using phrases like informing future requirements rather than developing a specific system. That's institutional wording, but it's also an honest signal. This is closer to a research question than an engineering blueprint right now. So what's genuinely still unknown? How large the eventual launcher will be, how many additional weapons it adds beyond current Virginia-class capacity, Whether it appears on the very first SSN-X hull or a later block the way the Virginia payload module itself arrived partway through Virginia-class production. And the biggest open question of all, whether the submarine industrial base will be ready to build it on whatever timeline the Navy eventually settles on. If you want to track this yourself, the Navy's own budget justification documents, published annually alongside the federal budget request, are public and searchable, along with Congressional Research Service reports on Navy shipbuilding, which follow SSN-X funding line by line far more closely than most general news coverage does. We cut a fair amount of the shipyard capacity and workforce data from this video to keep it focused on the launcher question itself. If that industrial base side of the story is something you want a full breakdown of, drop a comment and we'll put one together. Because whatever this submarine ends up carrying, it's not being decided in a vacuum. It's being decided against a fleet the U.S. isn't building, in a competition where the boat that arrives late is, in a very real sense, a different boat than the one that could have arrived on time.